We sat here a few days before the conclave in March of 2013, and we talked about who the candidates might be for the next pope. And you suggested that it's even likely that the cardinals would reach across the Atlantic and pick somebody from the Americas. And we know that Cardinal Bergoglio was high on your list that came out. And you were one of the few journalists to have him high up on that list. What did you see in Cardinal Bergoglio before the conclave that put him that high on your list?
Well, for many years I have known him, and I saw that this was really a man of God, but a man with a vision. I saw how he worked in the slum areas of Buenos Aires, but I also saw that he was a free man, and we see now this as a pope. He's a free man. He's not tied to traditions, pomps and circumstance that has built over centuries around an archbishop or a cardinal or a pope. He's free of this. And his simple lifestyle, I always thought, would be a magnificent testimony on the See of Peter. So I saw that, I knew that he had run second in the 2005 conclave. And even then I thought I had considered him as a possibility to be pope. And this time, when I was looking at the other possibilities, I felt that he stood a very strong chance.
Do you think the cardinals were thinking the same thing, or do you think they've been maybe shocked by what they've seen in the first year and a few months of his pontificate?
Did they expect what they got? I don't think hardly any cardinal had imagined that the papacy would move in the direction that he has taken it. John Paul II, way back in 1995, was conscious that the papacy, as it was being exercised under him and under previous popes, somehow wasn't connecting, wasn't in a way meeting the aspirations of the other Christian churches, or indeed many inside the Catholic Church. And he said then, he asked in his encyclical on ecumenism, please help me to discover a new way of exercising the Petrine ministry without diverging from the essentials. Bergoglio is actually doing what John Paul II was asking for input on.
What would be the block there? I mean, if John Paul II was asking for the same thing, because it was no secret that even before this election in 2013 that there needed to be some kind of tough decisions made and some radical changes to the bureaucracy. John Paul II called for it. What happened? What took 20-some years to figure it out?
Well, that encyclical was 10 years before he died. He was moving into the Parkinson's phase of his life, but also at that time there still wasn't the climate within the leadership of the Catholic Church. There didn't seem to be a sufficient desire. He got very little response to his request in the encyclical, which is the most formal papal document. He got very little response, even from the other Christian churches. I think what we are seeing now is we are seeing that Pope Francis is going back to the Second Vatican Council, giving the bishops a bigger role in the whole governance of the Catholic Church. I think it was very significant when he made cardinals last February that the first was the Secretary of State, and this was expected. The second traditionally would have been the prefect of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, and it wasn't. He put the Secretary General of the Congregation of Bishops in second place. And what he is saying is there is the successor of Peter, there is his assistant, the Secretary of State, and then there are the bishops of the world. And so he is changing the style of government of the Catholic Church. And by boosting the congregation or the Secretariat for the Synod of Bishops, he is effectively doing this. And if you look at all the Vatican congregations, when he's naming what his They call it congregation, but people normally would refer to it as a board of each of the Vatican departments. He's putting more bishops on each of the boards. So he's bringing the bishops more centrally into the role of governing the Catholic Church. And this is a major shift, I think, it's a major repositioning of the papacy as Peter with the apostles.
Historically, the way it was.
Yes, and it is saying, and he's been quite explicit about it, that the Roman Curia is to help the Pope and help the bishops, not to be intermediaries or censors or customs officers between the Pope and the bishops in their diocese. And this is a real radical shift in how the Church will be governed. And it's moving very closely back to what the Second Vatican Council was indicating. And he's explained this very clearly in his programmatic document. They call it Apostolic Exhortation, but it is his programmatic document, The Joy of the Gospel. There he is setting out very clearly. He said we have to decentralize. That he's making clear that the decisions that can be taken at the local church level, questions can be resolved there, do not have to come to Rome. And it's a process, it's a work in progress. He started a process. In many other fields too, he's starting processes. And I think this is a very significant decision. I mean, there's part of it was where he chose to live in the Vatican, not in the papal apartment down below. But this is really the question of governance of the Universal Church.
People have taken note of the fact that while he has emphasized collegiality, he's called for this decentralization, like everything you're saying, putting more bishops on boards or congregations or whatever. He also hasn't sort of minced his words about the kind of bishops he wants. Do those two things make sense together? That you can sort of emphasize this decentralization, but also sort of, it seems like, suggest exactly how the bishops and the priests are supposed to conduct their ministry.
He's very conscious that the role of the bishop and the priest in the Catholic Church defines very often how the local church is run. And he's doing two things. One, he's setting an example, because he's a man of action as much as of words, and he prefers action where possible. And he's setting an example of how the Pope is. He set an example as Archbishop of Buenos Aires, how a bishop and how a cardinal is, and previously as a priest. And he is now, by enunciating the kind of qualities he would like in a bishop, he wants to see in a bishop. He's told the Congregation of Bishops this. He's told the nuncios who draft the short list of bishops from the different dioceses around. He said, this is what I want. I don't want men with psychology of princes. I want men of prayer, men who are close to their people, men who live simple lifestyle, men who are poor, men who are humble, and men who have the gospel at their heart. He's very clear. We don't want careerists. We want men who have integrated into their own lives the humble, simple style of the gospel that was the style of the disciples of Jesus. It will take some years to see this work itself out in the church, but he's being very clear about what he wishes. Very clear. And I don't think there can be any nuncio around the world drafting the lists who will not now have to measure up the candidates he's putting in, whether they are in fact in line with this. And also when the Congregation of Bishops, when they sit around, he's changed the board membership for a start. But he also went in for the first time in living memory, he went in and told them, said, this is what I want. This is a Pope with a vision. And he says, we are there to serve. We are there to love people, not to condemn. He's making it very clear, the policy.
Do you see and hear from the bishops, and maybe more importantly, the bureaucrats here at the Vatican, do you see them jumping on this bandwagon with Francis and going with him, or is there some pushback or even resistance to what he's trying to do?
Well, look, from the beginning he understood you can change structures, but if you don't change the hearts of people, you really, at the end, don't deliver. And so he was very conscious from the beginning that he had to change attitudes. He had to bring about a kind of a cultural revolution, spiritual cultural revolution inside in the heart of the Catholic Church and among the priests and bishops. And not everybody bought into it immediately. Some people welcomed it, but it was a change of direction for them. It was a change. They had been taught in one way. They had been accustomed to live in one way. And here was somebody that was challenging radically some of their assumptions and some of their lifestyle and some of their way of selecting, of being pastors in their diocese, of governing the diocese. He is shaking, and it's like an earthquake, and there is resistance. I mean, some of the cardinals have said explicitly that they recognize that there is a resistance. And I know there are some cardinals who are even in the Roman Curia expressing resistance. First, they were doing it quietly. Now they're doing it a little more openly.
Because what? Because they realize that what he's doing is not changeable? It can't be reversed now? Or what is it?
It's a shock to their system. They have had one mindset. And this seems to some of them to be downsizing the papacy, downsizing the role of cardinal, the role of bishop. Not everybody is happy that the bishops' conferences get more decision-making power. And this is what Pope Francis wants to do.
He said that explicitly in
his
documents. He said they need to have more, and not just decision-making power, but major decision. I think he even used the word doctrinal authority.
Yes, he believes there is much that can be decided by the local church. Remember, for 6-8 years, he was president of a bishops' conference. They were, as he said, at the ends of the earth. They were far from Rome. What they were doing was, what was happening in Latin America was often considered as a second-class citizenship. Now the periphery has come to the center, with the experience of how the center dealt with the periphery. And this is why he resonates with the church in Asia. This is why he's resonating with the church in Africa. Here the government was more Eurocentric, Vatican-centric. You had some people from Latin America working in the Curia, but basically the way of thinking, the way of being church, the way of governing dioceses, etc., was Eurocentric. And it wasn't the experiences that happened in many of the churches on the periphery were considered marginal to how the church was governed. He comes from the New World, he brings a New World vision. And this newness is being received by the people with enormous warmth and with joy. And it's being received outside the boundaries of the Catholic Church. The Hindi press in India, they're reporting a lot about Pope Francis. A bishop from the Middle East told me on the Arab-speaking press, often he is on the front page. I remember immediately after the conclave, when the journalists, we had a meeting with the Pope in I think it was the 16th of March, I think you were there as well. And at the end he said, I'm not going to give you a blessing in the normal, formal way. I'll pray for you, give you a blessing in my heart, because I realize many of you are not Christians. Many of you may not even believe. There were 6,000 journalists, and he was spot on. Afterwards, I was interviewed by journalist from one of the big Arab media, and a Muslim woman, and she said to me, "I just love your Pope. He respects us." And then I saw that the following days, when he had the leaders of the other religions, the representatives of the other religions in an audience, he asked to have his chair on the same level as everybody else. And he's breaking through barriers. And so I have also discovered, traveling around in different, I was in Spain a week ago, I was in England some short time ago, I've heard from the United States, that many priests are being re-energized in their ministry by taking this cue from him.
So it's across the board.
It's across the board, and it's also with many, very many lay people.
You mentioned some of the peripheries, including the church in Asia. That's a church that's historically been a suffering church, a persecuted church, and the Pope himself has expressed a great interest in Asia and particular countries in Asia. What do you think his vision for outreach to the church in Asia might look like?
Well, look, 2/3 of humanity live in Asia. Christianity is 2 to 3% of the population of Asia. He is said very early on that his sights are on Asia. Remember, as a young man, when he was about 25, 26, he wanted to go to Japan as a missionary.
A young Jesuit missionary.
A young Jesuit. Yeah. He's very conscious of the history of Francis Xavier, Matteo Ricci, who reached into Asia, and Ricci, who went to the imperial city.
Court, yeah.
And he's very conscious of reaching out. And so his trip in August, he's going on the middle of August, he's going to Korea. But he's not just going to Korea, because he's going to a Catholic young people's gathering from 29 countries of Asia. So there he's making his first contact with the continent of Asia and with young Christians in that area. And he revealed that 3 days after he was elected, he wrote to the president of China, who'd just been elected, Xi Jinping, and everybody was surprised, he got a reply from the president. Now, remember that in Beijing, I was there 2 years ago, in Beijing, there is a memorial to the great people who've contributed to the civilization of China. There are 2 Westerns in that memorial. One is Marco Polo, and the other is Matteo Ricci. The Chinese are well aware that he is a Jesuit, that he's a Jesuit Pope. They see in his style that he's quite different to what has preceded us in the papacy. They have given him, since he's become Pope, a very positive press. Neutral, even positive. Nothing negative about him in the Chinese media, which is, of course, governed by the government and the Communist Party. I think this is very significant. So he's making inroads. And then when there was this building went on fire, collapsed in Bangladesh, and he wrote, the Muslims in the street, I heard there from a bishop, were so happy that somebody was taking notice of the plight of the poor workers. And he is really reaching the hearts of people far beyond the Catholic Church. And I think this is the test of the veracity of his strategy. I think this is very, he will go to Asia again, I think next year, to the Philippines, and maybe to Sri Lanka, which has come out of a terrible civil war where there are many questions over human rights, etc., etc. And he's also, I know he's got invitations from India, from Japan, he's got invitations from Myanmar. He wants to go to Africa as well, because he realizes that there is a thriving church. And remember that he's got this group of 8 counselors from the different continents who are advising, and he listens. He listens. And so we're seeing a new style of papacy, but we're seeing an outreach. John Paul II traveled. He went to 129 countries. I think 23 of them were Muslim countries. And he reached out, giving expression to one aspect of the Second Vatican Council, was to reach out to the other religions, the other cultures, and he did it magnificently. Pope Francis is also giving expression to that, so picking up the baton from John Paul II, and to an extent from Benedict, because he did some travel as well. But he's also picking up the baton from John the 23rd.
Which is
and
another element.
Paul VI, whom he refers a lot to, which was the creation of the Synod of Bishops under Paul VI, and the whole, what I talked about earlier, this internal reform. But also he's reforming, he's looking at the seminaries. Remember, the seminaries in the Vatican, in the Roman Curia structure, was originally under the Congregation for the Education of Peoples. Then there was a big battle, internal battle, and it was transferred to clergy. Now he's brought in a young bishop from Mexico who's very much in his own style and put him in charge of the seminaries. Because he's very conscious that if you don't change the formation in the seminaries, if you don't communicate this kind of model of priest and bishop that we talked about earlier, that he likes, that he feels is more in coherence with the demands of the gospel and the discipleship of Christ. If you don't get that across to the seminaries, you're not going to change much in the church. I've been struck here, you know, I've been here for many years, and I've been struck at hearing young seminarians here. I'm a John Paul II seminarian. I'm a Benedict seminarian. And I think of what St. Paul says in his gospel, you know. I am for Apollo, I am for Paul, I am for somebody else. He said, but are we not for Christ? And I think Bergoglio, Pope Francis, is very conscious of this. That they are priests, they're disciples of Jesus. Not of John Paul, not of Benedict, not of Francis, they're of Jesus. And he keeps focusing. And every morning in his homilies in Santa Marta, he is zoning in on this. The gospel, the gospel, the gospel. What is the gospel saying? And he's interpreting it in very original ways.
And down to earth, in ways that people understand.
This is why he's communicating. The ordinary person in the street doesn't need an interpreter, and it's not in Vaticanese. This Pope did not train in Rome. He spent little time in Rome. He doesn't have a Roman mentality. He has the language of his city, one of the big metropolises of the world. I mean, 12 to 13 million people. Rome is 3 million. He comes from one of the big metropolises. We've had no pope who's come from such a big city in the history of the papacy. None. And he speaks the language of the street, even the slang of Buenos Aires, porteño, and he uses it. And so sometimes you see him struggling to find the equivalent Italian expression that conveys that concept. And it's for this reason that the ordinary people, you don't have to be educated, you don't have to have a high school degree, a qualification or a university degree to understand this Pope. You don't even have to have gone to school.
And you don't have to be a Christian.
And you don't have to be a Christian. And I think this is one of his great gifts to the church and to humanity. And when he talks about the human trafficking or the exploitation of the migrants or the abuse of children, he speaks in language that's everybody understands. And I've been writing here for more than a quarter of a century. And sometimes you have to struggle to understand what the Pope is saying. And how do you put it into a way that your readers can grasp. And sometimes with some of these documents, it's not the easiest thing to do because they've been so carefully polished and honed and crafted. With Pope Francis, he believes in simple, clear language.
Considering everything that we've talked about, what do you make of his decision to canonize Pope John the 23rd and Pope John Paul II at the same ceremony?
I think it's quite significant. The process for the canonization of John Paul II had already, I would say, almost reached a point of no return when he was elected. I think it is very interesting that he chose, and he's on record as recognizing the great strengths of John Paul II. He was picked out, first of all, by the Archbishop of Buenos Aires, because the Archbishop of Buenos Aires knew him and knew his quality and said, I want this man as my auxiliary. And he came to Rome, and John Paul II agreed. But John Paul II also knew that this was a man who'd taken strong positions when that the theology of the people, the liberation theology, would not have Marxism as an integral part of the understanding of the theology. So John Paul II agreed with the Archbishop of Buenos Aires, and they made him bishop, auxiliary bishop. And then quickly he became coadjutor and took over in 1998 as Archbishop of Buenos Aires. And then 2001, in that mega consistory, he was made cardinal by John Paul II. So he's recognized that John Paul II did many good things. But he's also very conscious. When he was made cardinal in 2001, he was asked in an interview, your fellow Jesuit, Cardinal Martini, in Milan, thinks it's time for a Third Vatican Council. He said, no, I don't agree. We have not yet implemented the Second Vatican Council. This was 2001, 12 years before he became Pope. And I'm well aware that this is still how he thinks. And he's made it clear in some of his talks. The decision to bring John 23rd's canonization, together with that of John Paul II, is very significant. There's no doubt, I think, in the minds of most people that John the 23rd is a saint. There's widespread devotion around the world. At the end, in the session of the Vatican Council, at the end, there were many bishops in the council and cardinals who wanted the council to declare him saint by acclamation. And this was blocked. There are many testimonies of healings and cures through his intercession. And we have his own diary of a soul, which tells the whole story of his spirituality and life. And so Pope Francis is very conscious of John the 23rd. And I think it's also very significant. Not only does he make him, declare him bypassing the need for a second miracle, because there's such testimony to show that this man deserves to be declared a saint, but also he makes his secretary, 98 years old, a cardinal. The message is very clear. This is going back to the Second Vatican Council and saying the man who is responsible for responding to the Spirit to start the Second Vatican Council has a lot to say to the world today. And so by putting the two together, it's saying it's a message to the whole Church. This Pope has done much. This Pope has still unfinished business to contribute to the Church. And I think It surprised people at first because, as you know, many Polish would have preferred a separate ceremony. And
not just Poles, I've heard that from other people, that John Paul II was such a figure.
He was a towering figure, the athlete of God, who visited 129 countries, first to go into a synagogue, first to go into a mosque. He broke new ground, apart from the whole Eastern Europe and the fall of communism. But it's not everything. And there is still a lot more of the Second Vatican Council, which John Paul II did not implement. But what, by choosing to bring them together, he is saying, Pope Francis is saying, here are two great men in the history of the Church, who've contributed enormously and whose memory we wish to retain and to cherish and to draw inspiration from. Remember that when Pope Francis became Pope, what did he do? He went soon afterward and prayed at the tombs of his predecessors. And more than that, he insisted on going down to where St. Peter is buried. And the first Pope ever had the urn with the remains, with the bones, whatever, of St. Peter, the remains, brought out and put in display on the altar in St. Peter's Square. He has read the history of the popes, this Pope. He's a man who's very conscious of this great tradition through the papacy. He's conscious of all popes weren't saints, only a small number of them are saints. But some were great saints, and some really had such an impact on the world. And there's no doubt that John Paul II had a great impact on the world. But so too did John the 23rd, who changed the face of the Catholic Church, open to the Jews, open to the Muslims, open to the other religions, and gave a new inspiration on the whole field of social justice. Before he died, the encyclical Pacem in Terris, his intervention on the Cuban Missile Crisis. Most people in the world were not alive when John the 23rd died. So it's not the Pope that they grew up with. John Paul II is the Pope, the 26 years, almost 27 as Pope. He's the one that most people have lived with. So it's natural that popular sentiment is for him.
And a lot of people would see too the 8-year pontificate of Pope Benedict sort of being a continuation of what John Paul II did.
Absolutely.
So that's the only thing that most people in the world have known.
We're talking about 35 years of pontificate.
Yeah.
John Paul II plus Benedict, where there was a real synchronization in thinking. And yet this Pope Francis, drawing things new and old out of the recent history of the Church. And remember, he was not even an ordained priest. He was still studying when the Second Vatican Council finished. So he's the first Pope we've had who was not bishop or even priest at the Second Vatican Council. So he's a new generation. So as some historians have said, he wasn't part of the internal struggles. So he wasn't on one side or the other. And of given issues and dividing issues in terms of religious freedom, in terms of ecumenism, in terms of relations with the Muslims, with the Jews, he wasn't part of that battle. He was trained in the fruits of the Second Vatican Council and in the spirit. And this is what, I think this is part of the significance of this dual canonization.
One final question for you. Since you turned out to be very prophetic in March of 2013, before Pope Francis arrived on the scene, tell me, what can we expect to see from Pope Francis in the immediate future? I mean, the long-term implications of this are still yet to be seen, but what are you expecting to see, or maybe even hoping to see, in the next year or so with Pope Francis at the helm?
Well, I think within another year and a half, 2 years certainly, he will have reformed Roman Curia. I think we'll have seen a rationalized, downsized Roman Curia, I think we'll have seen in the next 2-3 years, we'll have strengthened the role of the bishops in the Catholic Church, and then he'll have addressed some of the questions on relation to family life and people. I also think he will certainly travel to Asia. I will be interested to see what his outreach to China will produce, because that would be a major breakthrough. And I am hopeful that under this pontificate something will happen there. I think he will reach out to Africa. He's very conscious of the poverty, of the conflicts. I think this is a man who is free and courageous. Recently, the Cardinal Secretary of State, Cardinal Parolin, said it could happen that he may decide to actually not just call for peace and intervene, but actually move into a conflict situation to push the peace agenda, to push for reconciliation. I think this is a Pope that continues to surprise even those who've known him for many, many years. He's experienced deep peace in the conclave. He had this feeling of great peace, and it's never left him, and he's very conscious he's listening to the Spirit. And then he's going to the Holy Land very soon. And he's going to be accompanied by a rabbi and by a Muslim leader. They're going to join him in Amman. They were back in Buenos Aires. He was dialoguing with the Muslims, with the Jews, with the Orthodox, with the other faiths. And this is a message. The Pope being accompanied by a rabbi and a Muslim leader on a trip to the Holy Land. It's a message for the whole region, where religion tends to be swept into politics and becomes part of conflict. And this is a very strong message. Never in the history of the Church has a Pope gone to the Holy Land accompanied by a rabbi and a Muslim. He is listening to what God's Spirit is telling him. You were here Palm Sunday. Journalists, we all had a text of his homily. He started and he put aside the whole text and gave a really inspiring reflection on the Passion of Christ and what it meant to modern man. I think this is a Pope it's a deeply spiritual leader of the Catholic Church, and he's listening very closely to what the Spirit is prompting him.
We'll wait to see what happens with that. Jerry O'Connell, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.